As Thomas Jefferson said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. It doesn't mean that we have to become vigilantes. It just means that we have to become truth seekers. Paul Kangas worked in 1961 for President Kennedy, and perhaps he'll tell you a little bit more about how he did that, in what capacity. In 1962, he also had something to do with what has come to us, what we know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was in naval intelligence.
Think back to where you were when Kennedy was killed. How many people in this room have ever fired a bolt-action rifle? I ended up in the military because I was a crack shot as a kid with a rifle. When Kennedy was killed and I heard that it was 4 or 5 or 6 shots in 6 seconds, instinctively I knew in my guts, and everybody that's fired a bolt-action rifle knew, it could not have happened the way the government said. The investigation, the cover-up, was able to disarm us politically and divide us and prevent us from doing the investigation ourselves. But now we know that what was done in Dallas was done by forces other than a lone assassin. Let me give you just a brief outline of the assassination facts that will show you that it could not have been. On the Zapruder film, there's a soundtrack and there's tape recorders. Numerous reporters were carrying tape recorders and happened to be in Dealey Plaza with their tape recorders on, just recording the sounds of the crowd. On the tapes, you hear 6 shots fired. The Warren Commission didn't like the fact that there were 6 shots on the tape. So what they did is they said, oh, the first one was a backfire, take that one away. The next one was a shot, and the next one was an echo, take that one away. And the next one was a shot, and the next one was an echo, take that one away. So we're left with only 3 shots, right? And so that's what the media did, tried to say there was only 3 shots. The problem was, even that distortion wouldn't fit within a 6-second motion with a bolt-action rifle. Just imagine shooting a bolt-action rifle, okay? You hold it. When you shoot a rifle, you have to aim carefully with a sight. You squeeze off a shot, and then you pull back the bolt, kick out the shell, load in another one, and then you have to re-sight. It's not like a machine gun. It's not like a toy. Each shot has to be fired carefully. When I was in the military, they taught us assassination techniques like this, that you're going to get 1 shot. When I was raised as a kid, my stepfather taught me, you get 1 shot. The logical way to do an assassination is to have 3 teams. Each team has 3 people, 2 of them with guns, 1 with a walkie-talkie. You place the 3 teams around, say, a Cuban village or a Vietnamese village when you want to take out a leader. At a prearranged signal, everybody is crouched and jumps up. At a prearranged signal, everybody jumps up, aims, fires, you get 1 shot, and then you run. If you listen to the tape of the assassination of John Kennedy, what you hear is 6 shots. That's the logic of the 6 shots on the tape. 3 teams. That's the standard way of doing an assassination. 6 shooters, each shooting 1 shot. Now, let's look at the politics of the assassination of John Kennedy. Here are the 5 reasons why Kennedy was killed. If you understand the reasons Kennedy was killed, you can understand who killed Kennedy. The 5 reasons Kennedy was killed are: 1, Kennedy came into power in 1960 when he won the election. What he was handed was, there was an invasion of Cuba being planned. He didn't approve of an overt invasion of Cuba with the US military involved. He was a liberal. He felt that it would be easier to trade with Cuba, to trade with the Russians, rather than to fight them. And so Kennedy didn't want to do the military invasion. Now, to understand the military invasion of Cuba, you have to understand where it came from. Who was the President of the United States in 19 1952? And who was the vice president? Okay, Nixon. So we have Nixon in the White House for 8 years. Eisenhower was a front man for Nixon. So we've had Nixon in the White House since 1952. When Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, and he started demanding that the corporations in Cuba pay wages to the employees of the American corporations in Cuba, the American corporations said, wages? What for? You know, we've been getting the sugar, Pepsi's been getting the sugar practically free. And Fidel said, no, look, we need enough money for the parents to work, to pay for their kids to buy food, medical supplies, education, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to have to pay them. And Pepsi-Cola didn't like it. Ford Motor Company didn't like it. All the other corporations down there didn't like it. At the time, Cuba had the highest infant mortality rate in Latin America. Had the lowest literacy rate in Latin America. The fewest number of doctors, the fewest number of you name it, they had it. The worst conditions in Latin America. All of a sudden, Fidel was going to turn it around. And he was a hero in America back then. I don't know if you remember, but Fidel Castro was a hero in this country because he kicked out this rotten dictator, Batista, who was starving the people, running drugs and child prostitution and gambling in Cuba. But the corporations went to Vice President Nixon, said, look, we don't like Fidel. We want him out. Will you overthrow him? Nixon said, yes. Just give me enough juice to get reelected. I'm running against some unknown underdog Catholic, and it'll be no problem. And as soon as I get elected, we'll kick Fidel out and put you back into power. That's the situation Kennedy inherited when, by a fluke, he gets elected president with the smallest electoral margin in history. And then here's Nixon's got Operation 40 already in full steam ahead going into Cuba as soon as the election's over. The election changed, so they had to stop Operation 40 and consult with Kennedy. They put on the brakes and stopped it. And then Kennedy said no. So the CIA decided they're going to go ahead and do it anyhow. I talked to a CIA agent who helped arrange the invasion of Cuba. And he transferred ships from the US Navy to the CIA in Guatemala. He took ships and had them repainted to look like civilian ships. They took aircraft and repainted them to look like private aircraft. They even shot bullet holes in the ships and aircraft to make it look like there was a fight going on. And then the CIA agent in Guatemala, who was in charge of the invasion of Cuba, named the ships after his wife, the Barbara, and his hometown, the Houston, and he called the operation Zapata after his oil company, Zapata Offshore Petroleum. This CIA agent was a man named George Bush, whose wife was named Barbara Houston Zapata. You get it. Okay. Bush, to this day, denies that he was in the CIA in 1960-61 for the invasion of Cuba. Why the ships are named that, he says, what do I know? Even when an FBI document was found directly naming George Bush as being the CIA agent in charge of the Cubans in Miami for the invasion of Cuba, Bush still denies it. If we can link Bush to the invasion of Cuba, we can link Bush to the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, in this case, I'm not only working as a private investigator, but I'm working as a prosecutor. I'm prosecuting the assassins of John Kennedy because I feel we, the people, are the government, and if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it. We keep digging up evidence on Bush's role in the invasion of Cuba. There's a professor in Washington, D.C. who's suing the government trying to get the files. The files for the invasion of Cuba are still secret. Why? Because they've got some interesting folks' names in those files that would rather not be known. For instance, if you remember Felix Rodriguez from the Iran Amok scandal, he was the guy who Eugene Hassenfoss called after Eugene Hassenfoss's plane went down, and then Felix Rodriguez immediately called Vice President George Bush, his good friend Vice President George Bush. How did Felix Rodriguez and Bush become such close, good friends? Because It turns out Felix Rodriguez was involved in the invasion of Cuba. Okay, that's about the fourth or fifth piece of evidence that we have directly linking George Bush to the invasion of Cuba. Now, that's the Cuba aspect of the assassination. So that was the motive for people being angry at Kennedy. Then Kennedy issued a presidential order withdrawing all U.S. personnel from Vietnam. How many people have seen the movie Air America? Ever seen that movie? That movie makes some interesting points about Vietnam. How the CIA was growing poppies. Oh, by the way, George Bush's nickname. Anybody know George Bush's nickname? It's Poppy. I'm sure it's not connected to poppy seed, but it's just an interesting coincidence. Anyhow, Air America makes the point that Pepsi-Cola had the largest bottling plant in Asia, in Laos. Never bottled a single bottle of Pepsi-Cola. It was the largest manufacturing plant for heroin in Southeast Asia. That comes out of a book also, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. The reason the United States was in Vietnam is to maintain the heroin traffic from Vietnam to the United States and the whole world. You remember the slang, the French connection? What's that about? That was slang on the streets for people getting their heroin fix. Well, I got to make contact with my French connection. Why? Because the French were the major suppliers of heroin to the world at the time. They had the monopoly. The French were kicked out of Vietnam. There's news items about Nixon going to Vietnam in 1958 to guarantee the poppy growers of Vietnam that the U.S. will protect them if the French are kicked out. So that's what was going on in Vietnam. That's why 20 million Vietnamese were murdered. That's why 58,000 young Americans were murdered, in order to maintain a heroin supply to the world, to make illegal funds, to fund illegal wars and secret operations. If John Kennedy had not died, 20 million Vietnamese would not have died. If John Kennedy had not died, the war in Vietnam would not have happened. Young Americans, our generation, would not have been in Vietnam. Now, I say that and some people try and dispute me on that. But people say, one person's death, how could it possibly have had that effect on the world? The death of John Kennedy. I believe it did. Okay, that's the second reason that Kennedy was killed. If you want to check this out, go to the library and look at the front pages of the newspapers just before, and the magazines just before Kennedy was killed. Front page story, U.S. News and World Report, the week before John Kennedy's killed. Headline, Kennedy's failure in Cuba. Subheadline, Lincoln's failures. They talked about the assassination of John Kennedy, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the week before Kennedy was killed. Why? Secret code. You know how these detective stories about people run little personal ads in the personal section? George, call Frank. That's all it says. You ever see those ads? The ruling class runs secret ads too, but they do it on the front page of your newspapers. We all use codes. Let me give you some codes that you may not be aware of. On the Watergate tapes, there are codes. There are 4,000 hours on the Watergate tapes. The Watergate tapes have not been released. Here's the code words. Nixon's talking to Haldeman. We got to pay E. Howard Hunt $1 million to keep quiet about the Bay of Pigs invasion. Here Nixon is facing impeachment for the Watergate burglary, and he's talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion that happened, what, 10 years previous? Impossible. That's code. Haldeman in his book even talks about the Bay of Pigs is Nixon's code word for the assassination of John Kennedy. When they talk about planning the assassination of Fidel Castro and his brother Raul, how the CIA, you know, they openly talk about how the CIA planned that. They're not talking about planning the assassination of Fidel and his brother Raul. They're talking about planning the assassination of John Kennedy and his brother Robert. They use code words openly in the media talking about this stuff. So these are some code words. Okay, that's supposed to get us into the third or fourth reason why Kennedy was killed. Back in 62 and 63, you know, there was actually 3 invasions of Cuba. Are you aware of that? There was the secret invasion in 1961. Then there was the military blockade, which I was involved in, which was actually an invasion. We were preparing, I was being trained, I was supposed to carry a radio on my back, a 45 on my hip. I was going to go in with the Marines, land on the beaches, and bring helicopters in on the beaches of Cuba, which is probably what they're planning as we're sitting here talking right now, to take Cuba back. That was the second invasion. The third invasion was being planned in New Orleans. And if you've seen the movie, you see it in there. If you see the movie, that's part of the Oliver Stone movie, the third invasion of Cuba, in which the CIA was planning a secret invasion of Cuba, a third one. They, Bush and Nixon just couldn't get it out of their craw. They had to get Cuba back. All that wonderful gambling, prostitution, drugs, we had it made in Cuba. They wanted it back. Jim Garrison was in New Orleans when Kennedy ordered the FBI to go to New Orleans and arrest the CIA agents who were planning another invasion of Cuba. Then after that, Kennedy talks about how he's going to split the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. Then he signs a peace treaty with the Russians. Promises no invasion of Cuba during his administration. And finally, a fifth reason. Take a dollar bill out of your pocket and take a look what it says on your dollar bill. Oh, I don't have one. On the back of your dollar bill, it will say, Federal Reserve Note. Who's the Federal Reserve? Is it federal? It's not. It's a private bank, private British bankers who print our money. Your money, they charge us interest for circulating our money. Kennedy didn't like that. They were ripping us off to the tune of billions of dollars to print and circulate our money. So Kennedy started printing $5 bills and $2 bills. And on top it said, U.S. government note, printed by the U.S. government. The bankers didn't like that. They were being cut out of the tune of billions of dollars a year. So here we got 5 different groups in society decided Kennedy had to go. And that's it. So they killed him. Now let me give you some details that have just been discovered. George de Mohrenschildt is a name you want to remember if you go to the movie. George de Mohrenschildt is a name you want to know about if you're investigating the assassination of John Kennedy. George de Mohrenschildt was this wealthy millionaire in Dallas and in Texas area, who it turns out was the babysitter for Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, one day, de Mohrenschildt is talking at a cocktail party to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, and he just happens to mention that he was in charge of Oswald. This was March 1977, and the Wall Street Journal reported that. The next day, an investigator from the House Select Committee on Assassinations called de Mohrenschildt up in Texas and said, we've got to talk. I would like to set up a meeting with you tomorrow. I want to talk to you about what you told the Wall Street Journal. Is that true? You were in charge of Lee Harvey Oswald? And de Mohrenschildt said, no problem, come on down. So the next day the investigator goes down, talks to de Mohrenschildt. 2 hours later, de Mohrenschildt is found shot to death in his home. Just natural causes, I'm sure. In his pocket, what do they find? His personal notebook. Who's in the personal telephone notebook of de Mohrenschildt? George Herbert Walker Bush, nickname Poppy, address on Blair Street. And de Mohrenschildt was, it turns out, now we discover, a CIA agent who was in charge of controlling a CIA asset, a patsy, Oswald. Then, who else is in there? A man named Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison, if you're from Dallas, is one of the wealthy oil millionaires from Dallas, who's a right-wing person, who held a party in Dallas, Texas, November 21st, the day before the assassination of John Kennedy. And who was at the party? Joan Crawford, Richard Nixon, George Bush, George de Mohrenschildt. Nixon denies being in Dallas that day. We found an FBI memo showing that the FBI suspected that Nixon was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. We reprinted it in this paper. they asked Nixon, "Where were you the day John Kennedy was killed?" Nixon says, "Gee, I don't remember, but I was not in Dallas. And if I remember where I was, I'll have my secretary contact you." Well, we found an article out of the Dallas Morning News. Here's Joan Crawford and Richard Nixon at the Baker Hotel in Dallas, Texas, 4 blocks from the scene of the assassination on the day of the assassination. He had been at the party. It's like the invasion of Normandy. All the generals are preparing for the invasion of Normandy. So they're at the Clint Murchison party in Dallas, Texas, preparing for the assassination. Now, here's another memo we found recently. It's an FBI memo in which 4 hours after the assassination of John Kennedy, a man named George Herbert Walker Bush, coincidence I'm sure, probably not the same George, calls the FBI and reports that a man named James Parrott, a political opponent of George Bush's in the Republican Party in Texas, had been talking about killing Kennedy. The FBI clerk took down the note, took the name and address of the person who called, and then this memo just drifted into the files and disappeared until somebody from the San Francisco Examiner discovered it during the '88 election. They called up Bush and asked him about it. Bush said, "I do not remember making the call." Well, the address listed for him was listed in Who's Who as his home address. So the reporters went to James Parrott, the guy that had been the subject of the FBI investigation. And Parrott said, "Sure, it was President Bush who made that call. I know that SOB. He and I have been political enemies throughout the years. He tried to frame me for the assassination of John Kennedy, tried to set me up as a patsy, just like they set up Oswald." Now these are just pieces of evidence. In this case, it's direct evidence linking George Bush to the assassination of John Kennedy. Here's a book about the assassination of John Kennedy that's banned in the United States. This book is banned in the United States. The editors, the writers of this book published very important photos from the assassination. And immediately, Hunt sued them for criminal libel for printing his name and picture in a book describing him as an assassin of John Kennedy. So the book's banned. The day of the assassination of John Kennedy goes something like this. The motorcade is traveling through Dallas, Texas, down Main Street. And all of a sudden, by the way, the route of the motorcade was published before the motorcade. All of a sudden, they get into Dealey Plaza, and the sheriff's car makes a strange dogleg turn through a little alley over into the grassy knoll area. And then 6 shots are fired and Kennedy is killed. Several people see the shooters. One of them, a woman named Jean Hill, saw E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis shoot John Kennedy from behind the grassy knoll. She and a bunch of citizens then chased them behind the picket fence and cornered them in a boxcar and called the police. These pictures are banned in the United States. Went on the Johnny Carson show, and he was on the Johnny Carson show talking to Johnny about his theory on the assassination. The lawyers for Johnny Carson's show asked Garrison before the show what he was going to talk about and how he would respond to this and that question, and they had all the questions and answers all written out. So, and Garrison knew what they were up to. They were just trying to make him look silly. He didn't tell him he had the pictures with him. So right in the middle of the show when the camera's on, Garrison opens up his briefcase and holds the picture up like that in front of the camera and then says, "Why is it this picture cannot be shown in the United States?" Johnny Carson has a heart attack, jumps up out of his chair, jumps across the desk, jumps on Garrison. This is all on tape. Tackles Jim Garrison right in front of the cameras and knocks the picture down. But Garrison's bigger than Carson. So they get up off the floor, and Garrison gets up and sticks the picture up in the air again so that the cameras can see it. And by that time, the people in the control room realize what's going on, so they turn the cameras around. so that they see the audience instead of the pictures. And that was the first chance the American public had to see the pictures. Now, the origin of these pictures is not perfectly clear to me. This one was taken by a photographer named John Beers in Dallas, Texas, one of the witnesses who met untimely death at a young age. And these pictures are in the National Archives. They're not supposed to be out. But what happened is Jack Anderson met somebody that worked in the National Archives and offered a bribe to somebody if they would take the pictures out of the file, walk into the men's room, and look for these shoes. I'll be wearing these shoes. I'll be sitting in the bathroom, and if you see somebody wearing these shoes in the stall there, just say Jack. I'll say, okay, just drop the pictures in the garbage can and go. And so Jack Anderson smuggled these pictures out of the National Archives. There's 7 of them. They were then published in this book. But they have another interesting history. Jack Anderson then slipped these pictures to Larry O'Brien, who put them in the safe in the Watergate. And after the Watergate burglary, Frank Sturgis, one of the burglars, was asked, "Why did you burglarize the Watergate?" And Sturgis said, "Because Nixon was interested in the assassination of President Kennedy." What? Say that again. Why did you burglarize the Watergate? Because Nixon was interested in the assassination of President Kennedy. Doesn't make sense, does it? What it was is they were trying to, what are plumbers? Plumbers plug leaks. There was a news leak about to happen. The Democrats had a chance to bring down the Nixon government in '72 and in fact put them in jail. Today, George Bush and Richard Nixon would be sitting in jail doing life sentence for the murder of President Kennedy if they had published these pictures back then. These faces are blow-ups from that picture. This is the little tramp with a hat. E. Howard Hunt, busted in Dallas. Frank Sturgis, busted in Dallas. This is a picture of E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, busted, burglarized. When you walk into a bank, you know that camera up on the ceiling there? That camera's not taking a picture of your face. I'm an investigator. When I took the investigator's exam for the state of California, they asked the question, what's the most unique part of the human body that's publicly viewable, that's as unique as a fingerprint? Investigators use your ear like a fingerprint. I get hired to find a missing kid or a stolen kid. If I have a picture, a side portrait of the kid, so remember to take side portraits to your kids, and you have an ear picture, that way you can stand there with the picture looking at kids in the playground and spot the kid. I don't care if they've got the kid, if the kid's 10 years older, 15 years older, the ear print is the same. It's eerie. Say an ordinary bank robbery case, just ordinary criminal case, not high-class criminal case. You get a picture like that of some people robbing a bank, and then you get a picture like that of the same people in the jail cell, and you put them together before a jury in any country in the world, you got a conviction like that. Why? Because when you can match those up, that's considered scientifically a match. That's an identifying mark. But with people like Hunt and Sturgis, there's all kinds of other identifying marks. For instance, who is E. Howard Hunt? He's a veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Who's Frank Sturgis? Veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion. You know who E. Howard Hunt is also? He's a famous detective novel writer. He writes under the name of James St. James. He's written hundreds of novels. The main hero in all of his novels is a man named Hank Sturgis. Turns out Frank Sturgis' real name is not Frank Sturgis. It's Frank Fiorini. He's an Italian. from Philadelphia, speaks Spanish perfectly. He is so good that he joined Fidel Castro's movement back in the 50s, became a guerrilla fighter with Fidel Castro against Batista, helped overthrow Batista government, worked his way all the way up to the chief of the Cuban Air Force under Fidel Castro. And his job was to kill Castro if Castro gets out of line, doesn't follow the party line, and maybe causes Pepsi-Cola to have to pay wages or something like that. So, but Frank Sturgis snuck out of Cuba when it was getting too hot. And when Castro found out who Sturgis was, Fidel called Sturgis the greatest spy in the world to have done what he did. He's still out there, folks. There he is, the Watergate burglar, the assassin of John Kennedy. And by the way, one more little piece of evidence here. A man named Lee Harvey Oswald, just before the assassination, November 8, 1963, wrote a letter to a man named E. Howard Hunt saying, "I would like information concerning my position. I am asking only for information. I am suggesting that we discuss the matter fully before any steps are taken by me or anyone else. Thank you, Lee Harvey Oswald." Do we have enough evidence to at least have a trial? Yeah. Okay. Now, how do you get that trial? Here's the secret to the trial. The Watergate tapes. On the tapes, Nixon confesses to hiring Hunt to kill Kennedy. It's important to realize that. You notice how the press is talking about, oh, we got to release all the JFK files now. Yes, we got to release the JFK files. What are you going to see when they open up the JFK files garbage bag? Nothing. Shreds. Nothing. They're going to say there's nothing in there. Well, I know about 100 documents personally that I can detail that are in there. These pictures, for one thing, are in there. And they're not going to release those things to us. So there's a trick to getting the files. The trick is we have to demand the Watergate tapes be released, because those 4,000 hours of tapes, our tapes, paid for by taxpayers' money, contain secret information. Now, by the way, you know about the 18-minute gap? I have a copy of the transcript right here, just before the 18-minute gap and just after it. There's a theory in biology called the black box theory. And it's a theory in science that if you know what goes into a reaction and you know what comes out of a reaction, you know what went on in the reaction. Okay, we know what Haldeman and Nixon were talking about before the 18-minute gap. We know what they were talking about after. What were they talking about? The Bay of Pigs. E. Howard Hunt. We got to keep Hunt quiet. We got to pay him $1 million. Otherwise he's going to spill the beans on the Bay of Pigs invasion. Huh? So what does that mean? So Nixon, when he gets the subpoena to turn over the tapes, or else, what does Nixon do? He calls in his speechwriter. He calls in the next president of the United States to listen to the tapes and decide what to do with the tapes. Should we burn the tapes? Should we release the tapes? Who's the next president of the United States? Who was Nixon's speechwriter? Pat Buchanan. The next president of the United States. Pat Buchanan listens to the tapes and says, you got to cut this stuff out about killing your Kennedy. You can't let them, you can't release that part. And so they edit out 18 minutes and blame it on the secretary. And that's because it was too hot. But then when Congress is listening to the tapes, they're not stupid either. They say, what does he mean, Bay of Pigs? Doesn't make any sense. And then all of a sudden the light goes on in somebody's head saying, oh my God, Nixon and Haldeman are openly talking about assassinating President Kennedy. Stop the tapes. Because what was going on at the time is they were listening to the tapes and releasing transcripts into the Mitchell trial. I've got copies here of what they have released. So they said, oh my God, you can't listen to these tapes anymore. We can't release them to the press, because then the public's going to find out what's on these tapes. So they stopped the tapes, and they did the same thing with the tapes they did with all the pictures from Dallas. They stuck them in the National Archives till 2039, right next to the JFK files. So anytime you write to your congressman, and you should, about releasing the JFK files, also include the Watergate tapes, and explain why. let me cover one more thing so that you understand the nature of what you're facing in this election. The 5 most important families in this country that control this country are the DuPonts, the Mellons, the Morgans, the Gianninis, and the Rockefellers. Now, if you draw a circle and divide it into 5 equal pies and label those, and watch this. Do you know where, during the American Revolution, way back then, you know where the American revolutionaries got gunpowder and the skill for making guns? Right, the DuPont family brought the technology for manufacturing gunpowder to this country from France and gave it to the American revolutionaries. They set up a school to teach people how to use guns and bombs. That became West Point. To this day, the DuPont family controls our U.S. Army like it's their private corporation. It's a tax-supported private army of the DuPont family. Anyhow, that's my bet, is Pat Buchanan's next president, because to be a president of the United States nowadays, you have to have been involved in the assassination of John Kennedy and part of the cover-up. Who was Jerry Ford? Jerry Ford was the person on the Warren Commission who interviewed most of the witnesses, who wrote most of the Warren report. It wasn't written by Warren, he was just a front. Jerry Ford wrote the reports. Jerry Ford interviewed the witnesses and decided which witnesses would be heard and which witnesses would be shot. Okay, where did the Warren Commission come from? The Warren Commission was created by a former Vice President of the United States at the time, the Honorable Richard M. Nixon. Went to Johnson and said, look, people in this country and all over the world are talking about the assassination of President Kennedy like there might have been something political behind it. And we don't want Congress investigating this assassination. We want to have our own controlled body that we control. We don't want Congress doing it. Those people, you know, they talk to everybody. They leak stuff all the time. So we got to have our own special commission. So Nixon said to Johnson, look, I got some friends. Jerry Ford, great Republican fundraiser of mine from Michigan. Earl Warren, great Republican fundraiser of mine from California. And some people from South Carolina. And we can set up our own commission. In fact, when Nixon was busted burglarizing the Watergate, one of the notes in the White House memos is that he received a call from Earl Warren saying, gee, Dick, too bad about that, but if you need another special commission to get you out of trouble again, I'm willing to head another commission. Earl Warren was willing to set up another Earl Warren commission to cover up the Watergate burglary, just like he covered up the assassination of John Kennedy. I want you to remember what I'm saying, because next month, when the press is screaming about, oh, we've released all the JFK files and there's nothing in there, if you don't hear me say, yup, we got the files, then nope, we didn't get the files. So no matter what you hear on the front page of the newspaper for the next 6 months, don't believe it unless you see a quote from me that we have the files, because I'm not giving up. And I'm sure Stone won't either. What we have is a nationwide, decentralized network of investigators, people like yourselves, investigating this. Each one of us have to become a point of light. Each one of us have to...
Coin a phrase.
To coin a phrase, yeah. We have to decide that we're going to keep hammering on our representatives' desks, sending petitions. It's kind of not too safe to send letters to our representatives because they just file them. But if you send petitions, if you circulate petitions and you get names on petitions, you know who signed it, you know how many names have been submitted. They get worried if you see that you're organized. They don't want you organized. Write me a letter, they want you to do. They don't want you to send me a petition because they don't want you organized. You have to think globally on this issue too and act locally. We have to, everybody that's running for office has to have signed the petitions for releasing the JFK files and the Watergate tapes. So you got anybody running for office around here? Take the petition to them, ask them to sign it. If they won't sign it, write a press release, hold a press conference, picket them until they sign it. We want this to be a large movement of people all across the country. It already is, and it's massive. Yesterday on the Oprah Winfrey show, they did a poll of everybody in the audience about this size. How many people believe the Warren Commission report? Anybody see that show? No TV up here. Okay, good. In a whole audience this size, one person raised his hand. One person still believes the Warren Commission. That's probably the only person in the United States that they could get.
I would like to know if, on the conclusion of this, if this is brought to a successful conclusion, the tape or the files are released, would you conceive of a situation where we could dovetail that into perhaps petitioning for the repeal of the National Security Act and the disbanding of the National Security Council, which I feel is the real issue here? It is the shadow government we must not destroy, even though we must destroy, even though we do bring the killers of Kennedy to justice.
All these issues are connected. During the war last year, I was going around during the anti-war marches in my suit carrying a big sign that said, "Jail Bush for the murder of JFK." And people were looking at me, this was before the Stone movie came out, they were saying, what does that have to do with the war in the Middle East? And I tried to explain to them that we're in the war because the government we have in power is a government just like Hitler shot his way into power in Germany, killed his political opponents. In this country, the government that you have there is a false government. Let me tell you about the video that Bill Cooper is circulating now that you raised it. And we now have a new phenomenon, computer enhancement of photographs. The reason the Bill Cooper version of the Zapruder film did not exist prior to the computer enhancement of photographs, I believe, is that that film has been manipulated. In fact, the technician who manipulated that video, who created that video, has been speaking in the Bay Area against that video. Wherever Cooper shows up, he shows up. And Cooper had him arrested and thrown out of an audience because the guy stands up and said, "Look, I faked that video for Cooper." I don't think that the driver of John Kennedy shot John Kennedy. One, if you shoot somebody with a gun, there's a huge cloud of smoke comes out, and that smoke contains nitrates, which adhere to everything. You can't get them off your hands. When the police arrest you for a crime involving a gun, the first thing they do is give you a nitrate test. There would have been nitrates all over Kennedy, all over everything. Of course, they could have covered it up. We know what they now did with the body. I'm not sure I want to argue with Cooper on this, because if the driver shot Kennedy, it doesn't disprove or prove anything. It shows that maybe the Secret Service was involved. But I mean, from what I know about guns, it couldn't have happened that way, I don't think, because we have so much evidence that the shots came from the grassy knoll.
You may have, your photographic evidence may have proved that Sturgis and Hunt were at Dallas on that day, but what proves that they were the trigger men?
They were seen by about 30 eyewitnesses. They were chased by them. In fact, Gene Hill, one of the people who saw them kill John Kennedy, who chased them into the boxcar, who had them arrested by the police, is going to be speaking in San Francisco next month. She's written a book, which comes out next month, the end of this month, with an introduction by Oliver Stone about her role. She chased them down. She had them arrested. She identified them. She fingered them. To this day, she still maintains that it's them. She had a Polaroid camera with her. The FBI took the Polaroid camera from her and confronted her, took her up into their office in the Texas School Book Depository and asked her what she saw. She told them, and they leaned over her and point blankly told her, "Don't you dare tell anybody else what you just told us." She shut up for 20 years. She was so scared because witnesses were dropping dead left and right. Gene Hill was one of the people who fingered her. Also, a man named Lee Bowers, who was watching the motorcade route with binoculars, standing right behind Hunt and Sturgis, saw them shoot the president from the railroad control tower where he was standing, got on the telephone, called the police, saw them running across the railroad yard into the boxcars being chased by all these people, reported them to the police, and the police, then the train, by the way, starts pulling out of the railroad yard, And he thinks, hey, I'm the supervisor of this yard. Nobody cleared that train. What's going on here? Who's driving that train? This ghost train starts driving out of the railroad yard with Hunt Sturgis and this other unknown guy. And so he's the controller. And he doesn't have any way to stop the train. But he thinks, aha, there's a junction on the triple overpass. And he throws the little switch. And the train can't go anywhere. Clank, it stops. And the police surround the train and arrest E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis for the assassination of John Kennedy. Case closed.
The Hunt suit that you spoke about earlier, is that the one that Lane talks about in his recent book? Was he not the attorney, I believe, for the defense on that?
Yes, he sued Canfield and Weberman, who published this book, and suppressed that book. The Liberty Lobby got upset by that lawsuit, so they published the pictures in their newspaper. Your local newspaper published them too. I don't know if they've been sued yet, though. I guess they haven't been sued yet. Anyhow, so Hunt then sued Liberty Lobby. And Mark Lane thought, my God, what a chance. We bring the whole thing into court. And he did it. And in court, he's got E. Howard Hunt on the stand, testifying. An incredible event. And so Mark Lane asks Hunt, where were you the day John Kennedy was killed? And Hunt says, I was at home watching it on television with my kids. So Hunt goes on cross-examining him on other things. And in the process of cross-examining him on the other thing, he shows him the pictures. And Lane, not being stupid, said, what do you mean? 20 minutes ago you just said you were home with your kids. Why would your kids have to have their memory refreshed as to where you were the day John Kennedy was killed? And that's why the jury found the Liberty Lobby not guilty for criminal libel, because they thought Hunt was involved from the pictures. They thought it was Hunt. We've had a jury opinion on these pictures.